Hi, I'm Shane Jones, biology instructor at the College of Lake County.
I'm Jason Cashmore, also a bio instructor at CLC.
Hey Jason, have you ever found yourself in a quagmire?
Shane, I have. Sometimes I feel really bogged down.
Yeah, well, quagmire is actually another term for a bog.
How is it? Well, that's handy, because today we're actually going to do the Bog Lab. Ordinarily, we would take our students to Volo Bog, which is in Volo in Lake County. Unfortunately, right now we can't take our students anywhere, and Volo Bog is actually closed. So we've come to Beulah Bog, which is just over the border. It's just outside of East Troy, Wisconsin. We're going to learn about bog ecosystems, how they form, and their characteristics. So come along with us, let's check it out.
All right, so here we are on sort of just the edge, on a ridge line just above the bog, which is down below us here. And it's easy to think that this area has always looked this way. Our lifespans are pretty short, but in the larger time scale of how long the Earth has existed, geological time scales, it's just a couple of seconds. This area has changed dramatically just within the past 15,000 years or so ago. Beginning maybe about 30,000 years or so ago, there was a large sheet of glacial ice that moved down through this part of the United States, southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And it was during a period of climactic cooling, so the warmer seasons, think of like the summer months, were much shorter than the overall cooler times of the year, like the winter months. So as we had cooler periods, longer cooler periods, say longer winters, the glacier would sort of advance, and then in the summer months it might melt and retreat back a little bit, but then would advance and then retreat back. But because it was overall cooling, you kind of have these seasonal variations, forward, back, but always going further and further south, kind of pushing the land out in front of it like a bulldozer, forming many of the land features we see today, like the very hilly nature of this part of the Wisconsin, Illinois, is due to that kind of bulldozing action of those glaciers, creating a lot of hills that we call moraines. And then about 15,000 or so years ago, maybe 12 to 15,000 years ago, that the climate changed, started to warm up. And so the warmer months became more extended than the cooler months. So as it had been advancing, then began to retreat, and it would melt a little bit more than it would advance each year, and then sort of slowly, still moving forward and back a little bit, but overall retreating. And as it retreated, it left behind kind of a barren landscape of cobbles and boulders and gravel. And at times, particularly during warmer periods, large chunks of the ice may break off the front of it. And the ice sheets were enormous, easily 50 or 500 feet high in many places, in some places maybe even more. Some estimates maybe up to a mile or so. And so imagine a sheet of ice that large. It's sometimes large chunks of it breaking off the front of it. It's called calving. And then these massive chunks of ice sort of sitting isolated in the ground as it began to warm, and the sheer weight and mass of that kind of pressed down into the ground as it thawed out, creating a little depression, what we call a kettle. And that's essentially what we see out here. We're kind of on the ridge line of a giant hole or kettle created by a massive chunk of ice that broke off from that glacier as it receded about 12 to 15,000 years or so ago. And so all that area out here would have filled in with that water as it melted, creating a little kettle lake. But because of the sheer high ridgeline, particularly around this one, it didn't form into many of the lakes that we find in Lake County, but rather formed a bog. And a part of the reason is that the water source for this would have just come from precipitation, and the term for that is ambrotrophic. Basically means to be cloud fed, through rain and snow and the like. There are no streams or groundwater that kind of carries water in or out of this to any significant amount. So whatever falls in here water-wise really is coming from the sky, and so it's very stagnant, and any accumulation of stuff doesn't get flushed out regularly. So as we'll see a little bit later, when we get down to the bog, there'll be some very unique characteristics of moss that grows across the surface of that old kettle lake, depositing material as it dies and sort of accumulates over time, creating the very conditions that are essential to create a bog.
So while we're still up in this ridge, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about some of the mosses that we see growing here, since moss is going to be something that we continue to talk about throughout this lab. And there's a number of different kinds of moss that we see growing up here, but I wanted to refer everybody back, if it's the spring semester, to the plant diversity lab that we did at the beginning of the semester, or if this is the fall semester, you'll be doing the plant diversity lab probably in a few weeks. So if you remember, mosses are in the phylum Bryophyta of the kingdom Plantae. So as bryophytes, they don't have vascular tissue, which is why we see them growing on the ground where it's pretty moist, generally in shady areas. And they're very short, because plants that don't have vascular tissue can't really grow very tall, because once you get too far from the ground, the air is too dry. Without vascular tissue, they can't transport moisture up. And then also, mosses reproduce with spores, not with seeds. And this is a great example right here of a moss that's getting ready to reproduce. So a lot of my students, when they see this on a moss, they think that it's a flowering part of the moss, and so they think that mosses are flowering plants. But these are actually sporangia. These are stalks with spore pods on the end, and spores will be produced inside of here, and then the plant will release those spores. They'll hopefully get blown away on the wind and then grow into new mosses. So when you see this on a moss, not flowers, moss is not a flowering plant. This is actually where they're producing the spores. And then this also kind of illustrates something that Shane was talking about a few minutes ago of primary ecological succession. So when the glaciers first retreated and we had this landscape that was mostly rock and gravel, and there was really no soil here, some of the first plants that were able to show up were mosses, because they're able to grow anywhere that there's suitable moisture. So they might be able to grow in the cracks and crevices of the rocks and the boulders that were left behind. So this is a good example of one of the species that you would have been able to find here 12,000, 15,000 years ago.
So here we are just on the very edge of the bog as we're starting to enter into it. And you can see off to my left a hillside there with some of our upland forest tree species like oaks and hickories. And right at the bottom of that is where it kind of flattens out. And so when the glacier was receding and water began to melt and fill this up, imagine that was the shoreline, and where I'm standing right now would have been a completely open lake, extending way out to my right. But in the very early stages of succession of this kettle, we would have had along the margins some sphagnum moss growing right over the surface as a floating mat. And now so much time has passed that mat has actually well extended beyond just the edges. They're now much closer to the middle, as we'll see a little bit later. But down here by my feet you can see the moss itself. Moss is an avascular plant or non-vascular plant. Has a very small leaf-like structures on it, and it can hold and absorb a lot of water, both in its live and dead forms. So it retains a lot of water, acts kind of like a sponge, and is very spongy to actually walk upon. As we'll see later, as we get more closer to the center, as it's kind of floating more on open water, as you step on it, it moves around a lot more. Where here it might be a little bit firmer, only for the fact that this is the oldest part of the bog, and so there's been more time for material to accumulate at the bottom. And one of the unique things about bogs is the presence of this moss, which makes it stand apart from other wetland types like marshes or swamps. So this sphagnum moss, or peat moss as it's known, is sort of characteristic of bogs like this, and it also contributes to some of the other species that we find here, because the moss itself can secrete some acidic compounds, and when it's alive, and even after it's has died and decomposed, there'll be some leaching of organic acids out of it. And what that does is to create an environment where very little decomposition will take place. Normally our decomposers like bacteria and fungi will break down things after they've died. They can kind of recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem. But the moss here, as it grows along kind of over the water, as it started probably 10,000 plus years or so ago, as it grew over the surface and produced these acids, it really inhibited microbial growth. So imagine, for example, like the surface of your skin is somewhat acidic, or we use things like ascorbic acid or citric acid in foods as preservatives to prevent microbial growth. Well, in a sense, that's kind of happening here, but in a natural way. So as the moss grows, the water becomes somewhat acidic and inhibits microbial growth. In addition, the fact that it's saturated also limits the amount of oxygen that's present too, which additionally contributes to not much decomposition. So as the moss began to grow and things would die and fall into it, they would literally kind of stack up from the bottom up. And then create more of a firm, base underneath this. But the moss would just kind of keep growing as a floating mat over the surface, and it continues to grow even today. And at the center of this bog is open water, which we'll see a little bit later, but eventually will be covered as this moss continues to grow out over that old kettle lake. So we're just outside the bog right now, kind of on the margin of what would have been the shoreline of that old kettle lake. Just before actually getting to where the moss is. And if you look at the water right here, you can see it's stained quite brown, and that's not due to any kind of pollution. It's actually a natural staining of the water due to tannins. And tannins are compounds that can be found in plant material naturally. So if you look at this old oak leaf, it's not green anymore. The chlorophyll is more or less gone, but you can see it's a brown color, and these are from tannins. That are inside the leaves. Can also be found in pine needles, but also in sphagnum moss. So when the moss dies, it can start to leach some of these compounds out, and some of them are acidic. There's tannic acids as well, which contributes to the low pH of the water. And so although this may look like it's somewhat polluted, it's actually not. It's just an accumulation of these tannins that are sort of leached out of the leaf material from like oak leaves or pine needles, from like the tamarack needles of those tamarack trees we'll see in the bog, as well as the sphagnum itself when it dies and doesn't fully decompose, but will kind of leach these things out. And because the water body is ambrotrophic, really only receiving water inputs from precipitation, it's not regularly flushed out. So over time, as this stuff accumulates, the acidic nature of it will also tend to increase, or the pH will be lowered, which will contribute to decreasing the amount of decomposition that happens, which is very characteristic of the bogs, as we'll see. So here you can see a whole bunch of trees, and this isn't exactly a forest. We're still in the bog. These trees are another species that you're really not going to find anyplace else in this area. These are called tamarack trees or larches, and they're really a unique tree in that, well, for a few reasons. One, they are a coniferous tree. Now you can't really tell that now, but they do produce cones and needles. So these are some needles from the tamarack that would have fallen off last year. And you might think, well, if it's a conifer, then how come there aren't needles on it right now? Because we think of conifers as being evergreen trees. And that's true for most of them. Most conifers will be green all year round and have needles all around the year. But one of the things that makes these trees unique is that they're a deciduous conifer. Their leaves, or their needles, which are a form of leaf, will actually fall off, just like we have with oak trees and maple trees. But you're not going to find these, growing in your neighborhood or in forests around, forest preserves by your house. These are very sort of specialized trees. They can live in conditions that a lot of other trees can't survive in. So here they're literally growing in the moss. Their roots are sort of kind of intertwined within the sphagnum moss and the hummocks and so on, and kind of can contribute a little bit to the formation of the hummocks. And they're well adapted to living in very nutrient poor and acidic soil conditions. Outside of bogs in this area, you're really going to have to go into Canada to find tamaracks. They can be found in areas where the soils are very thin, very acidic, and they can also survive very cold temperatures. So you can sometimes find them on the edges of tundras or into boreal forests, or if you go into very high elevations, like in the Rocky Mountains, where the soil conditions are quite poor for most tree species. So it's just another great example of a species that is in our area, but is quite unique and is tied to a particular habitat type, such as this, where they can survive in conditions, very nutrient poor, acidic conditions where most other species cannot. So right here you can see kind of a mound here, and this is one of the features that you'll find in bogs like this. This is called a hummock. It's kind of a hump or mass of moss and other organic material that hasn't fully decomposed, and the moss has kind of grown over it. And as you look around, you can kind of see where it look like little valleys and then rises. So it doesn't always grow completely flat and smooth. It can be kind of undulating, but you can tell it's still a mat. It's kind of floating. As I kind of press on this up and down, you can see how it kind of moves around. And as I move this tamarack tree, you can see it's fairly soft. It's not very hard and firm like a solid mass of ground would be. And then coming out of this particular one, you can see cranberry. And so a lot of people don't realize it. A lot of people like cranberries and cranberry juice, but cranberries are actually a bog species. And these will produce the cranberries that we're all familiar with. And then, of course, there's new varieties that have been created to meet our own desires for size and stuff. But the native species of cranberry live in bogs just like this. And even the cranberries that are grown for cranberry juices and things like that are grown in bogs. So it's kind of a shrubby plant, woody plant. It's got small kind of oval-shaped leaves on it. That will grow kind of low, but contributes to kind of a shrub area or shrub zone that we can find in bogs. And so later on in the season, it'll grow some flowers, and then those flowers will later turn into cranberries. So here we have a great example of a specialist type of species, and this is one that you're really not going to find anyplace else in Lake County. Or for this matter, in southern Wisconsin. And this is a pitcher plant. So you can see they've got some tube-looking structures sticking up out of this moss. Now this is separate from the moss, the green stuff that's around it. So this is called a pitcher plant. This is a plant that's specialized to capture insects, or it's a carnivorous plant. And a lot of people are familiar with Venus flytraps, which we don't have in this part of the world, but operates similarly, trying to capture insects as a way to supplement what they can't get naturally from the environment. So again, because things really don't cycle, there's not significant nutrient cycling that occurs in a bog ecosystem, because the material that falls in here really doesn't get decomposed. So any compounds like nitrogen, phosphorus and other things that might be released back through decomposition really doesn't happen because of the lack of decomposition. So many of the species that are found in bogs are adapted to living in very nutrient poor conditions, and this is a great example. So the plant itself does photosynthesis. Now these are fairly early in the year, so they look a little more reddish, but they will turn green as we get into the spring and summer months. So they do photosynthesis, but they supplement what they can't get from the moss, which most plants would get from the soil, because it just doesn't provide those nutrients, especially nitrogen. So you can see here around the rim, there's like some little hairs, if you can make those out or not. Those help to kind of direct the insects down into the tube. So the plant may release some chemicals that kind of attract the insects, much like flowers would, to go inside to seek some nectar. And when they go inside, the walls get very smooth, kind of very waxy, and the insect will drop down to the bottom where there is a pool of fluid. And in that fluid, the insect will drown, and then can be slowly dissolved by enzymes found within that fluid. And as the enzymes sort of dissolve and liquefy the insect, the plant can then absorb the nutrients for itself and obtain the kinds of things that most plants would naturally get from the soil, but in this case aren't able to. So a great example of a specialist species coming up with an adaptation to survive in conditions that are very nutrient poor. All right, so here we are in the center of the bog, or what we can refer to as the eye of the bog. And here's where you get the best sense of that this area used to be a lake, a large kettle lake. The sides are very high, like we saw before, and so the really only way for precipitation, or the only source of water really, is the precipitation that fell in here. And so when the glacier was receding, we had quite a significant lake here, and you can see evidence of that, just the open water. But this will not remain like this forever. Now it'll probably take, thousands of years, but eventually this open water you see here will look just like what we have in front of us here, with the sphagnum moss and the tamarack trees and all the rest. This is sort of almost like stepping back in time to what the shorelines would have looked like thousands of years ago, kind of along the edges or the bases of the ridgeline around us. So we have our mat of sphagnum moss here, along with some very young tamarack trees, so kind of the earliest stages of the succession, at least in the case of a bog. And kind of right here is the edge. So imagine back thousands of years ago, this sort of being the very shoreline edge, at the base of the ridgeline. So as moss began to grow out along the edge of that, as some of that material would die off at the end of the year, it would sink to the bottom, and you can see some darker material here from seasons past. And so it would sink to the bottom because of the lack of oxygen and the acidity of the water. There'd be little to no decomposition. So as it sank to the bottom, it would sort of build itself back up to the surface. And once it got back to the surface, it would give kind of a new platform for the moss to grow over. And that process is continuing right here at the edge. So as I look, it's a pretty, almost like a drop off here at the end, but I can see some material kind of accumulated along the bottom just underneath the surface. And so given more time, the moss will continue to grow out over that, stuff will fall and accumulate, and will continue to go all the way out toward the center. So even though it's very sort of static, it doesn't seem to be changing right now, it is, of course. It's just very slow. So this mat, in a sense, will continue to grow outward, and these tamarack trees will grow much taller, similar to the taller ones we saw back there earlier. Now, because things don't decompose, rapidly or if at all at the bottom, we can use bogs in addition to, just our knowledge about ecological succession and the changes, but also what changes occurred climate-wise and ecosystem-wise going back much further in time. So there used to be tundra and boreal forests and other ecosystems that now are found much further north in the continental US or into southern central Canada or in the Arctic Circle. So as the glacier receded, the first sort of true ecosystem that would have formed here would have been tundra, followed by boreal forest and other types of forests. And we can find evidence of those species here in bogs like this. If we were to take a core sample, think of a hollow pipe, it went all the way to the bottom and then brought that back up and looked at what was at the very bottom and then kind of going through each layer closer and closer to the surface, well, we can find evidence of plants that no longer exist here, like those you find associated with tundras, boreal forests, and other ecosystems that are now much further north, because their pollen and their seeds and other plant materials have been preserved over time. So, I hope you've enjoyed this lab. This is a great place. If you ever get an opportunity, I would suggest coming to Beulah Bog. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out to your instructor, and I'm sure they can help answer any questions you might have. All right, take care.